So, the title of this episode is The World's Most Technologically Sophisticated Genocide is Happening in Xinjiang. It's named after a foreign policy piece written by the two guests today, Rayhan Asat and Yonah. In addition to both being lawyers, Rayhan is also the sister of Ekpar Asat, who was forcibly disappeared by the Chinese Communist Party in 2016 in Xinjiang. And she's the president of the American Turkic International Lawyers Association. As for Yonah, he is legal counsel at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, named after the Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary. This is a very difficult conversation, as you might imagine, so please be mindful of that when you're listening to it. There is quite a lot of mention of the tactics being used by the Chinese government against the Uyghur population and other minorities in China. And as a quick side note, this episode was actually recorded before the August 4th explosion in Lebanon, and I hadn't released it before due to the fact that I didn't want to do anything else in August. So yeah, I hope you find this conversation instructive, and I hope it moves you to take some action as well on your side. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes. If you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Hi, Joey. Good to be with you. So my name is Rayhan Asat, and I am Uyghur attorney based in Washington, D.C. I've been working as an attorney for several years, and my main practice is anti-corruption and international investigation, and a bit of dispute resolution. But I also I'm very much interested in entrepreneurship, and largely in part, my brother inspired my past entrepreneurship, and I founded and currently serving as the president of the American Turkic Bar Association, which is catered to the needs of American Turkic lawyers. We're relatively new, but still like a growing institution. Yeah, and I got involved in the Uyghur human rights crisis, unfortunately, because this directly I am affected by it. Regardless, I grew up in a very modern Uyghur family that even the government held as like a model citizens or model family, especially my brother, who has this, great platform that has been perceived as a positive bridge between ethnic minorities and the Xinjiang local government, and often held by the government through their own state media, and even used his platform to be able to respond to the citizens' concerns on different issues. Unfortunately, he was also detained during this Uyghur human rights crisis when the government started building the infamous internment camps or concentration camps for the Uyghur community as a whole. So it's a very tragedy, and for me, I always struggle between being an attorney and who goes to court and defend others, to now being advocate for my brother and trying to free him from these detention camps.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into your brother specifically and the wider situation. Yonah, would you mind introducing yourself briefly as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us, Joey. I'm Yonah Diamond. I work at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights as an international human rights lawyer, and I'm the legal counsel at the center. We actually met Rayhan through another international human rights lawyer, and what we do at the Wallenberg Center, named after the Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews during the Holocaust by issuing false papers and setting up safe houses. So our center is sort of informed by his legacy that the power of one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can transform history. And so we represent sort of modern day Mandelas and political prisoners around the world who represent the struggle for human rights in their own countries. And so when we were introduced to Rayhan, we took on her brother's case as emblematic of the persecution of the Uyghurs. And we'll get into that more.
Thank you both for having this conversation. If we can start with like an overview of what we're talking about. I think most people probably know that something is happening and they may have seen some of the headlines, but depending on how much they've read, they may not know the extent and even like sophistication of the problem that we're talking about. So before going into the argument, the main argument of the foreign policy piece that you two wrote, that for calling this a genocide, can we start with a general timeline? Like how did it start, the scale of it maybe, and if we can also touch a bit on what exactly is the CCP, like the Chinese Communist Party's motive and public rationale anyway for doing this?
Yeah, I start by saying that 2020, this year, marks 4 years into the Uyghur human rights crisis. And now we're calling it a crippling genocide. And there has been a lot of report that since as early as 2016, over 1 million Turkic Uyghurs are detained in these camps or prisons, and even forced labor factories, so adding the slavery component to it. So China watchers or journalists and investigators found overwhelming evidence through the government's own official documents, political speeches, that detainees who are held in these camps are often subject to military-style discipline, transformation, soft transformation, as they call, and forced confessions. But the government tried to use a soft spoken language, like a re-education camps, to define what it is doing to the Uyghur people as a whole. But because it has a bit of historical resonance to it, because this happened during the Cultural Revolution, when the entire China was subject to some sort of re-education. But what we're seeing now is that the government single-handedly singling out entire ethnic group, not just Uyghurs, but Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, all Turkic groups. But if we look at my brother's case as an example, somebody who is incredibly successful, massively successful, and as seen as a positive force by the government through their own words, this re-education camps proves it's nothing but a euphemism for the physical and mental destruction of the Uyghur people. And perhaps Yonah can add more to his understanding.
Yeah, sure. I think it's important. It's hard to conceptualize this genocide, but it's important to, as Rayhan often refers to it, as a multi-pronged approach to destroying the Uyghur people or future generations. And it's important to note that each demographic, whether it's men within, between the ages of 20 and 50 who are sent to these camps, the majority in these camps the vast majority are men, right? But the women have been subjected to an increasing systematic program of forced sterilization. And so we have an increase in either women who are widowed or those who have been sterilized. They're subjected to other kinds of forms of birth prevention. And then children, up to 500,000 now, have been kidnapped essentially and put in state-run facilities, where some have even committed suicide. And so we have a multi-pronged approach at erasing the future generation. And it's very disturbing because it's a very slow process, but it's also very sophisticated, like you noted, Joey, where there's this incredible mass surveillance, the world's largest mass surveillance intrusive program, cameras on every block, facial recognition. And, you know, I actually just recently watched testimony. My grandmother and my grandparents survived the Holocaust. And I just recently watched my grandmother's testimony for the first time, actually. And, you know, it's so hard to conceptualize that entire peoples could be targeted, because she was talking about how she had to live under Catholic papers in Budapest during the Holocaust, but she would see daily, you know, Jews being shot behind where she worked and just in the streets, you know. And so we see it in movies and whatever. We think like, you know, this is just surreal, right? But and to have a program where you're with technology, it makes it almost even scarier. There are many differences, obviously. I mean, the scale of the Holocaust, hard to compare, but what we do see that is a parallel is the targeted of entire ethnic groups simply for who they are. And I think Rayhan's brother is a, you know, paradigmatic example because he's someone that the Chinese government respects and has even praised, and yet he is still in this disappeared state.
Yeah, in the piece, you mentioned that Rayhan's brother, Ekpar Asat, I think they call him like a bridge builder, a positive force, as Rayhan just mentioned. And like this is an important detail, and I thank you for mentioning it because the CCP's supposed rationale, and of course I'm using rationale in quotation here, is that they are fighting religious extremism. Now, this is something that's very common in, especially since 9/11, the so-called war on terror. It's really used to justify quite a lot of things. Myself, I spent a lot of time involved in Syria-related activism, and this is obviously what the Syrian regime uses to describe pretty much everyone. Can we, Rayhan, would you mind talking a bit more about your brother? Who is he? When's the last time you've heard of him? And like just what's happening to him as far as you know?
Yeah, so my brother, you know, as I said, he's a tech entrepreneur and he's so successful, but at the same time, he has a massive heart. You know, he's a philanthropist. He, due to personal reason, because of, you know, a cousin that he feels very close to, was impaired, and he couldn't hear, you know, since the age of 4. So he took this cause so personally. So he ended up, you know, making, helping kids with disability as his like a signature campaign. So he built like a lot of like these charitable initiatives, and as a result, you know, the government also like cooperated with him on these like initiatives and always praised him, to the point that you know, his reputation started to expand, not just within China but also like internationally. And former U.S. Ambassador to China Max Baucus in 2014, when he was visiting Urumqi, the city I'm from, he ended up meeting successful and prominent entrepreneurs and business leaders, and he also met with my brother, and he met a bunch of Uyghur business leaders, but he nominated my brother as an international leader to the U.S. State Department's premier program called International Business Leadership Program. Some of the notable alumni community include the former Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and the New Zealand's beloved Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. So he came to this program representing China as a part of a delegation. He's part of like a 9 group members, and you know, he impressed everybody during his trip, and his host can attest to that. They even wrote letters talking about the memories of hosting him. But so the program ran about a month, after returning from this program, immediately he was detained, and right after, so he returned in mid-March, late March, and 2016, and March, mid-March, yeah. So after he returned, he organized, and I think this is a program that he organized even while he was in the United States, and he was keeping it like a sort of a secret thing from me to just like delightfully surprise me. So together with the regional sports bureau, he organized international boxing tournament, inviting boxers from Central Asian countries and Malaysia, and together with the Chinese team, a friendship boxing tournament, if you will. And it was incredibly successful. So you have like Chinese flags, and the audience were like a mix of ethnic minorities and the Chinese, even like you see like pictures of police officers. And it was an incredibly successful program that even Chinese government CCTV reported. And this is like a late March, but early April, in fact, April 7th was the day, 2016, he was detained. And that was a period that I'm still like a student at Harvard Law, just trying to finish up my exams and hoping to see my brother like a 2 months time at my graduation. And suddenly my entire family canceled their trip to the US, and they told me like they couldn't make it. And I just couldn't understand how my entire family like refused to come to my graduation when I'm the first Uyghur to graduate from Harvard. And while I was processing, trying to understand why would they do this to me, it turns out the reason was because my brother was detained and they couldn't just leave and come to attend my graduation.
Right.
And it's been 4 years and I'm still struggling trying to find out if he's alive, like where is he held, like is he in Urumqi, or is he being relocated like other prisoners? And all this time I thought he's like in this one of those famous internment camps until this year, after I started meeting with State Department, and until late December last year, I met with the members of Congress, and they wrote a letter to the Chinese government asking my brother's whereabouts. That's when I learned that he's actually imprisoned, and now facing a 15-year imprisonment for trumped-up charges inciting ethnic hatred, when a system designed to oppress people like my brother. The government accuses him inciting ethnic hatred.
So as I mentioned, I spend quite a lot of time on Syria-related activism, and recently I had Wafa Mustafa, who is a Berlin-based Syrian activist whose father was forcibly disappeared in Syria. And so I bring this up because I suppose on one level it no longer fully surprises me that governments are capable of horrors, but one thing that we mentioned before, and maybe we can get into it a bit more, is the bureaucratic aspect of it, or maybe the sophistication, the technological aspect of the methods used by the Chinese government. We of course are seeing widespread torture. You mentioned in your piece electrocution, rape, waterboarding, stress positions. You mentioned the forced sterilization campaigns against Uyghur women, especially the multiple reports of murders in these so-called re-education camps, which many have called concentration camps. But besides that, which is obviously horrific in its own ways, we're also seeing an extremely sophisticated bureaucratic response by the CCP that actually defies, or maybe that's not the correct term, I don't know, but it actually makes it even more difficult to comprehend the scale of it. So can we talk a bit about the more intricate bureaucratic stuff, the advanced online censorship, the monitoring, the tracking, all of that, and maybe even your experience with it, if you've had any, or maybe people that you know that have had besides your brother as well?
Yeah, the very fact that it's been 4 years that we don't even know where my brother is should be
Mm.
quite telling.
Yeah.
And many governments have their own track record of human rights violations, but often, like, at least you would have some sort of access to the family member who is detained. But in our case, and I can speak for the members of the Uyghur community, you can't even talk to your detained family. You don't know if they're alive. So not only the person who is detained, your entire family members are suffering from not knowing if they're alive. Are they subject to torture, waterboarding, electrocution? All these are common patterns of brutal treatments that Uyghur detainees endure in these internment camps. But now I'm in the United States. Like, as a sister, of course I care about my brother. Every day I think about him. It's even like, breaks my heart to talk to you about him. As a sister, like, trying to be his advocate rather than just a lawyer trying to save the world. I can't even talk to my family about him. Every time, like, if I want to, like, I've gone to media, like, what happened? I want to know if there's any response from the government, at least like he's alive. They can't even talk to me about this because our conversation is obviously heavily monitored. And if they even dare to tell me something, perhaps they could be sent to these internment camps.
Right.
And I think that is the terror. And I'm using this word very carefully, that the Chinese government installed in all of us. So my brother, if we're going to call it my brother as a victim, then me and my family members are survivors. But even we are subject to this, like, state terror, to the extent that I cannot even describe the pain of pretending and talking to my family as if life is normal. Like, we can't even address the existence or non-existence of my brother. I mean, that's how intrusive the entire surveillance system is. Like, the communications between me as a sister who lives in the United States and my family members back home. And I cannot imagine how much my family members' activities in Xinjiang, in Urumqi, are monitored. And I always think, like, when you use a personal story, it's a far more powerful way to explain the pervasiveness of surveillance. But yeah, so otherwise, like, what we see is, like, in Urumqi, like, everywhere you go, like, people have to either, like, scan their identification cards, which already flags you. Like, I'm sure, like, my parents are in the system. So, the minute they hand in their identification card, when they pass through any sort of security, and there are a lot in Urumqi, they would be already flagged and also subject to all sorts of harassment that they can never discuss with me. So, and that's the thing. And I think that's what makes this genocide so uniquely dangerous, because of its technological sophistication. And it also allows China to destroy and conceal the scale of atrocities from the global attention.
And it can be, yeah, sorry, Yonah.
Sorry, I just wanted to add the 15-year sentence that Rayhan cited, and correct me if there's been an update, Rayhan, but that was basically through word of mouth. So we haven't seen any court documents to that effect. And so essentially, her and her family are still, subjected to the pain and suffering of not knowing.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Rayhan was saying as well. Like, part of what's scary about the CCP's method is its global implications as well, in addition to everything we're talking about. Because in the same way as some governments, and again, I can focus on Syria, they would test out certain weapons on civilian populations. For example, the Russians have done this and the Syrians have done this. these are technologies that can then be just sold to other governments in other countries that want to replicate it. And China will be able to basically say, well, this is how successful we have been. So now this is a product that can be sold on that market, so to speak. You in your piece, you're both lawyers, and in your piece, you make the argument that what the CCP is doing is a genocide. Can you walk us through the legal arguments? I'm not a lawyer. I only have a kind of like a basic understanding of international law. I know the Geneva Conventions when it comes to war-related situations, of course, and I know the basics. But can you walk us through the legal arguments of the term genocide, and why does calling this genocide actually matter in international law?
Sure. I mean, Rayhan, if you want either one.
Yeah, like I talked earlier. Why don't you go first, and I'll add to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so just really quickly, I mean, under the Genocide Convention, which is the universal definition, at least right now under international law, it's certain acts against members of a group with the intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. Mm-hmm. And acts include killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions to bring about the group's physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so if you go through, it's not so complicated when you look at, and it doesn't have to be all of these factors to constitute genocide. It's any one. So mm-hmm. Even just taking the imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, with the intent to destroy that group in whole or in part, we see very clearly that there is an intent within the policy and the directives of the Chinese Communist Party, the highest levels, repeated orders to break their origins, their roots, their connections, to round up everyone who should be rounded up, to implement the birth prevention program. And the numbers are pretty horrifying too recently, as you see in the article, population growth rates in the Uyghur heartland plummeted by 84% between 2015 and 2018. And then sterilization rates are skyrocketing in Xinjiang while plunging through the rest of China. In a major prefecture, like Kashgar, only 3% of married women of childbearing age gave birth in 2019. And now we see that the government is trying to destroy some of this evidence. I mean, by taking down either the websites or not reporting birth rate information, or even in Houston with the burning of documents. It's not clear what that's about, but I imagine it's and detainees are being transferred to different camps. It's unclear if prior camps evidence is being destroyed. It's a very systematic campaign, and like I said before, with the detaining of the men who are of child rearing or marriage age, and by enforcing the forced sterilization of women of childbearing age, and by forcibly removing the children, which is the fifth act under the Genocide Convention. Mm-hmm. All of this is creating this multi-pronged conditions intended to destroy the group either in whole or in part. And I'll let Rayhan, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and as you stated, we're both lawyers, and genocide, G word carries huge weight, so we mm-hmm. don't like to use it lightly. As we discuss this issue, as we're writing this paper, as Yonah said, like there has been debate, like the CCP's rationale or motive behind this is more of assimilation. I think it's way beyond assimilation. Assimilation did happen in the 90s or early 2000s, where there was a emphasis on bilingual education, like I went to a bilingual school, but this is like a whole different scale. And when we debate whether like this meets a definition of genocide or not, which obviously are, as we clearly laid out in this article, I think we would be trivializing the pain of millions of people who are in these camps. And the argument that this is somewhat limited to assimilation falls on its merits very plainly, because if you look at my brother as an example, he's highly educated individual. He speaks Chinese very fluently. Like, this is nothing about assimilation. He's well integrated into the Chinese society. And look at all these intellectual scholars that are detained in these camps. They were the pillars of the Uyghur society. They were the ones who are educating the next generation of Uyghur kids. They are way beyond well-integrated Chinese society. So I think we would be doing immense disservice to human suffering if we're going to make the argument that, you know, the Chinese government's rationale is to assimilate. It is to destroy the entire Uyghur people through, you know, as I have emphasized in many articles, through this like a multi-pronged approach from all different angles, with Uyghur men being detained, women sterilized, and even like being forced into marriage with men of not their liking, and Uyghur children are being separated from their family. Yeah, the Chinese government is perfectly laying genocide, and it's happening on our watch. And I don't know how many stories the individual Uyghurs have to share with the world so bravely, and the world can finally take action and say, this is enough.
And this also includes the Chinese government sending Han people into Uyghur homes, as far as I understand it. Can you talk a bit about this, and what are they trying to do with this move? And this is not new, of course. I think the first time I've heard about it was like 2 years ago, but I may be wrong on the timeline, so please feel free to correct me on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, they call this as becoming family initiative. It's nothing but becoming. It's unbecoming. You know, you can't force people to love each other and become family. A relationship or love often happens organically. But what they are doing is that, you know, every Uyghur, especially women, these women whose husbands are detained in these camps, are subject to the government's surveillance through these civilians. So they are in their own beds, monitored by these hands. And so imagine a scenario where your thoughts are monitored by somebody. You know, the law is often carried out by enforcement agencies or like police departments, but these civilians get to decide whether these women should be sent to these re-education camps after they spend a year or two with this family. I cannot imagine the horror of somebody living in my own home and monitor my every move and decide whether I should be sent to a camp or not. And how scary is that? You know, like somebody just like, you know, decide just grab you in your own home.
And this this allows for state-sanctioned sexual violence and rape, you know? I mean, watchers and officials are being placed in Uyghur homes, in their beds. I mean, this is truly shocking. And yeah.
Part of what I was trying to do, of course, in just preparing for this episode, is reading up on some of the reports that have been released, of course, in the past year. My understanding, as I said, or my involvement when it comes to this is still fairly limited. I'm trying to get a bit more involved. And in the end, before finishing the conversation later on, I will ask you if you can talk a bit about how people can get involved if they want. But so one of the reports that I was reading, and I have it in front of me, is the so-called Xinjiang papers by the New York Times. And you linked it as well in your foreign policy piece. And for those who don't know, it's over 400 pages of internal government documents that were leaked. And some of this stuff are, well, I will link all of this in the associated blog post on the website as well. But can you talk a bit about your reaction when you actually read the report? And for those who don't know, what did it show, in addition to everything that we've already talked about, I guess, about just the resolve that the government, the CCP, and Xi Jinping, even personally, like some of these are his like internal speeches and calling for things like I'm just randomly quoting in front of me, like using the organs of dictatorship. These are his words, and showing absolutely no mercy, and like really just such a harsh language that just shows the extent, the dedication, I guess we might say, of the CCP to really crack down, murder, destroy, to levels that are very rarely seen in today's like in 2020.
And you're absolutely right. And the tone was set at the very top. The statements like absolutely no mercy. So when you are a commander-in-chief and using these words, of course, you know, your followers are going to implement those policies because you allowed so. In fact, you even encourage it. And in addition to these statements, one was in particular so troubling is again government's own official documents break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. And if these words are not telling, I don't know what it is to convey the government's motive behind destroying the Uyghur people as a whole. So when I hear these statements, I'm like, I you know, my brother is there for a reason, to break him both mentally and physically. And it's not just about for him to forgetting his Uyghur identity, because we grew up in a very well integrated society. I think, you know, I speak Chinese very beautifully, and you know, I also love Chinese culture. So there was never this rejection of Chinese culture in some ways. Like I have friends within the Chinese culture, long-term friendships and neighbors that we grew up with. So, you know, I think with these languages, what is incredibly telling is the Chinese government truly intended to physically and mentally break the Uyghur people so that they can ultimately achieve this goal of destroying the people as a whole. And you know, Yonah mentioned about these like forced sterilization programs, and if you look at the data, you know, the statistic obviously show, as Yonah mentioned, it is having the desired effect. You know, Uyghurs' birth rates are plummeting while the rest of China is skyrocketing. And it's so painful for you know, Uyghur person to hear these things, and just especially like, you know, the diaspora community, because we have no way of knowing what's happening over there, and we get to see this through the plain words of the government. And I'm glad that there were some brave government officials within the party's own that actually thought that these are incredibly despicable crime that the Chinese government committing, and at least what they can do to expose it.
And what has the CCP's response been to either those leaks, which I believe were in November 2019, or the multiple reports, obviously, that have been coming out, the activists that have managed to leave, or not even, like they are forced to become activists, unfortunately. Just the people who managed to go elsewhere, like leave China and leave Xinjiang, and manage to get some codes out, or manage to even send some photos, or stories of what happened to them personally or to their loved ones. What has the government response been on the international scene, let's say? Because I know that there's, I'm fairly interested in like disinformation campaign, and obviously in the case of Syria, it's largely the Russian government doing it. As far as I understand it, the CCP has also kind of ramped up its efforts to do this. I've seen some campaigns in India, I've seen some in the US. They seem to be relatively unsophisticated compared to the other things, but that might just be an impression compared to the Russian tactics, which is more advanced, I would say, in terms of disinformation. So yeah, how has the CCP tried to I don't know how to ask the question. Like, how has it tried to mask what it's doing? How has it tried to respond to the international condemnations, even though, and maybe you can talk a bit about this as well, like the international condemnations have been relatively muted in the Muslim world. There isn't much coming out of Muslim leaders on this, and there's actually active complicity sometimes. So how would you describe the international dimension of it, either from the CCP's own responses, or maybe other governments who have done some declarations here and there, but nothing more than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Rayhan was just on a panel on disinformation on this very topic, so I'll let Rayhan start with this.
The Chinese government has deployed this like a multi-pronged approach to discredit the survivors of its horrific crimes. Mm-hmm. And it's using propaganda and disinformation campaign to either attack this individual activists or journalists and even institutions that are reporting on this issue. So initially, it started with silence, and later it's outright denial. But now I see a new trend, which is pivoting to offense.
Yeah.
And using the family members appear on state propaganda TV or shows to portray this happy Muslim and happy Uyghurs face to discredit them. But I mean, and it's not even well executed. I mean, especially there was one I find incredibly insulting to the world's intelligence by portraying this young Uyghur boy guy, like in his early 20s, falling in love with this Han girl in inland China, and on their first day, like he would just start to FaceTime his mom, telling like how beautiful this relationship is, and so forth. Like nowhere, like not even Xinjiang, like even like here in any parts of the world, young people can afford to live in a very fancy apartment. It's we're all like in debt, like student debt, and that's what I mean. But it's not even well executed, because it obviously is like a government paid apartment. This guy just like gets up in a fancy apartment in the morning and start to shave and get just ready to date this girl. And these are just like a examples of using social media to its own advantage, to use this aggressive disinformation campaign to portray a whole different image. But at the same time, I think in terms of the Muslim world, I think they're using this like that entrapment policy because the ones that condemn the Chinese government are often Western democracies who represent two sides of world economy. But the rest of the world, like economically, they're very much dependent on China, especially using this like a Belt and Road initiative, what the Chinese government is using to buy their conscience. And they not only they remained as bystander countries to this mass atrocities, they even ended up supporting the Chinese government, on paper, to even like endorse in this letter right after the 22 Western democracies condemn the Chinese government. So it's truly like a multi-pronged approach that shows the sophistication of the Chinese government in understanding the modern social media platform and the disinformation and propaganda campaign.
Yeah.
And perhaps you and I can add more.
Yeah, I think this is so important and so dangerous, because I always ask myself, how was the world indifferent during the Holocaust? It makes no sense. Countries stood as bystanders, appeasing, and again, there are differences, but it's almost scarier today for this generation with social media, TikTok, which has other problematic aspects, and the Chinese government is taking advantage of these platforms, and they know that we get so easily distracted nowadays. So if there's a video of someone dancing online, that's more interesting to your average citizen, unfortunately, than what's happening in the camps, right? And it's very scary in that sense. And China's ambassador to the UK was actually on BBC this month, and it was actually quite the botched interview. If you want to link it as well, like he was fumbling for it. He was shown footage of the Uyghurs blindfolded, shackled, and shaven.
I saw it,
being led onto trains, and he did not even deny the veracity or the authenticity of the video. He just kind of fumbled with his words and said it was a standard prison transfer, and then went on to say how happy Xinjiang is and people who live there are. And so it's not a very it's not so sophisticated when it comes to these sort of statements, but it is when it comes to places like the UN and the Human Rights Council, which is also very scary, because China has been able to use its political and economic influence. In July of last year, there was a letter from 37 ambassadors, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, Pakistan, that positively evaluated the human rights developments in Xinjiang and praised China's quote unquote counterterrorism and de-radicalization success, and justifying the camps. Okay, this is 37 countries in July. And then in October of last year, a joint statement at the General Assembly's Third Committee on behalf of 23 countries condemned the persecution. That's only 23 countries. I mean, that's not so many. And then a group of more than 50 countries supporting China sought to commend praise China's remarkable achievements in the field of human rights. Of course, that includes countries with horrendous human rights records like Russia and Egypt, etc. But so this disinformation campaign and influence is being exercised in multilateral institutions, and it's successful. And so that's why it's very scary, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And I want to add this. So another thing the Chinese government was quite successful is that they handpicked certain country officials that would come out in terms of evaluation in their favor, and then allow them to visit these re-education camps selectively. And even like those camps that are in the Chinese government's eyes, like, good to pass these examination or initial reviews, are not glamorous at all. There was a video of these detainees singing like, if you're happy, say yes. I mean, what is that? But again, they handpicked those countries that would be in their favor. I mean, that just goes to show like how much of China's influence penetrated in all over the world, either through buying 20% media in Kenya. But at the same time, like I'm so glad that Yonah gave the example of the Chinese ambassador to the UK, this interview in particular, because I think we need to ask those questions from ourselves. With the level of sophistication in technology, modern technology that China has achieved at this moment, if there's still like a video footage of men blindfolded and shackled being led on these trains, how many scenes we're not seeing?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can cover up so much, we still found these videos. How many horrific treatments, humiliations these are detainees are experiencing every day and every second that the world is not seeing. And these are the kind of questions that we have to ask ourselves, but to act, because I think the damages are done, and it would, it would remain through generations. And I think we don't have the luxury of time to still raise awareness, but to act.
Yeah. And on that note, actually, if listeners who are listening to this, if they want to get involved, are there like Uyghur groups, for example, diaspora groups that they can get in touch with? Is there any upcoming campaign that might be useful for them to know? And maybe like more generally, where can they find more information other than all of the links that we just mentioned, which I will link in the associated blog post, which is quite a lot already, of course. But just as general recommendations for those who are listening, where can they go if they want to be more involved?
So I want to mention too, and because you talked about Syria, so I came across yesterday a website called Syrian Archive, I believe,
Yes.
where like they documented through like a different categories what has happened in Syria, and I thought it was really good. And I think we do need to document the genocide, and because maybe one day, we'll hold these officials and the architects of genocide accountable. There's one organization that I deeply respect is called Shahid Base, We Bear Witness, in translation. So they document victims of these camps, and basically their brief information on what accounts or charges that they are held in these camps, and just very brief story. And to document this, obviously they need resource and public support. So I hope people could use support them, either by donating or just even like supporting them, telling them what a great work they're doing. And I often say this because yes, these Muslim governments, I don't think they represent the will of the people. These governments are run by these individuals, dictators, if you will. But the Chinese governments the Chinese government did able to buy the conscience of these world leaders, but they can never buy the conscience of the people. So I hope we can do like grassroots organizations at the basic level. If there are university students at the University of Beirut, for instance, like organize like events and invite us to come, and at the law schools, for instance, and perhaps like even organize like student-led coalition, perhaps Muslim students in support of like Uyghurs, and those kind of things, because I think public opinion does matter, and hopefully public opinion indirectly would help to change the behavior of the Chinese government. And I want to add last, we didn't have the time to touch on this, but the use of forced labor, Uyghur forced labor, is a huge issue right now, and it should discuss us. And corporations either wittingly or unwittingly profiting off Uyghur genocide. But we as consumers have to hold our corporations accountable by writing letters to this more than 83 companies that are entangled in this Uyghur slavery, and ask them how they are sourcing their products, where their products are manufactured, and how do they feel about this. And by public shaming, hopefully, of our corporations, we can indirectly change the behavior, this appalling behavior of the Chinese government.
And I will link even that website, the one that you just mentioned. I will link it also in the blog post. Yonah, is the Raoul Wallenberg Centre doing anything on that front that would be of interest to listeners as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you can check out our website, rwchr.org. As I said, we represent cases like Rayhan's and as Rayhan said, it's so important to share these and get these stories out, because these are the stories that really move the public and move politicians to act. And so we represent these cases, but we're also shining a spotlight on the wider repression and, in this case, genocide within Xinjiang, and pushing for accountability mechanisms on the international stage, in Canada with our parliament, in the US through Congress, to push for either Magnitsky sanctions, which are an important human rights sanctions, which either sort of freeze assets or impose travel bans on the officials and architects of these camps. So we're kind of leading that front in Canada to push for Magnitsky sanctions, both in Canada and globally, and also leading the front against sort of the whitewashing of crimes in the Human Rights Council. So the Raoul Wallenberg does all of these, and I would say, you know, pushing, like I would say, as to Rayhan's point, because there's so many industries that are inextricably linked to this genocide, it's important that we, you know, push our Congress people or parliamentarians, politicians, to strengthen our laws that force companies to be accountable for their supply chains. I think that's such an important thing here, because it's such a huge problem. And there was just, you know, a major report that came out that implicated companies like Nike, Adidas, H&M, Amazon. So just as consumers and as citizens, it's so important to not be complicit. At the very least, we can ensure that we're not complicit, and that starts with our buying habits. But we need to strengthen our laws around modern slavery and ensuring that companies are transparent and have due diligence requirements to look into abuses, especially slavery and genocide. And that's why the genocide term is important here too, because it will push our politicians to act. Whereas the term human rights violations, abuses, repression, it doesn't do this particular situation justice, and the amount of products coming out of Xinjiang. So I think that's important.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, I really want to thank both of you for participating in this conversation with me. I'm hoping that I will have more on those as well in the future. And yeah, I mean, Rayhan, I can only imagine what you're going through, and I really appreciate you taking the time and doing this. And Yonah, thank you for co-writing that piece as well, and for what the center does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We very much appreciate you hosting this, and hopefully, like, you know, your listeners will be tuned in and help with this course, so we can actually make an impact.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.